Welcome to Unbound American Stories, where we bring to life the voices of often overlooked figures who helped shape the United States. In each episode, we explore the careers, convictions, and quiet choices of people who rarely make it to the front of the textbook, but without whom our history would look very different. The story you're about to hear was created with the help of AI-driven research. It's designed as a starting point, a vivid, contextual background to spark your curiosity. If you're doing serious research, writing for publication, or just want to go deeper, we strongly encourage you to check facts against peer-reviewed historical and academic sources. Think of this channel not as a final reference, but as an invitation to join a much larger, ongoing conversation about our past. In this audio novel, Ben will guide you through the life of John Jay, diplomat, constitutional thinker, and the first Chief Justice of the United States. You'll hear how a quiet New York lawyer became a leader in the Continental Congress, a key negotiator of the Treaty of Paris, 1783, a co-author of the Federalist Papers, a controversial architect of the Jay Treaty, and a governor who helped set New York on the path to ending slavery. Settle in, listen closely, and let this story inspire you to explore more of the rich, complicated tapestry of American history.
Thank you, Lisa. John Jay, Quiet Architect of the American Republic. Chapter 1, A Boy Between Worlds, 1745 to 1764. John Jay entered the world on December 12, 1745, in the bustling colonial city of New York. The British Empire was at its height, but the Atlantic world he was born into was fragile and contested. Empires clashed, trade networks frayed under the strain of new taxes, and ideas about rights and authority were beginning to unsettle the colonies. From the start, Jay's life was shaped by being between worlds, between old Europe and new America, between religious communities, and between the modest security of a colonial merchant family and the precarity of the Atlantic economy. His father, Peter Jay, was a merchant of French Huguenot descent. The Huguenots were French Protestants who had faced intense persecution in Catholic France, especially after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Many fled to England, to the Netherlands, and to the American colonies. The Jay family's Huguenot roots mattered. They instilled a sense of religious seriousness and an attachment to liberty of conscience, principles that would echo years later in John Jay's work on religious freedom and in his suspicion of unchecked power. His mother, Mary Van Cortlandt Jay, came from one of New York's old Dutch families, connected to the landed Van Cortlandts and related to other prominent colonial clans. Through her, John Jay was tied to the older Dutch Reformed elite of the province. The Jays thus occupied a middle space, not the richest of New York's mercantile aristocracy, but comfortably situated and well-connected. In this world, education and family alliances mattered as much as money. Yet John's early years were shadowed by fragility and fear. Around 1752, when John was still a young boy, a smallpox outbreak struck the family. 2 of his siblings were blinded by the disease. The threat of sudden misfortune was never far away in colonial life. Illness, fire, economic failure, all were constant specters. The survival of some children and the maiming or death of others was a reality that impressed itself on parents and siblings alike. Though specific personal reflections from John at that age are scarce, we know his father became deeply protective and serious about the children's education and moral formation. The Jay family would not squander the opportunities God had allowed them to keep. Peter Jay's business interests were part of the larger Atlantic economy, and like many merchants of his station, he was entangled, directly or indirectly, with the system of slavery that underpinned much of that commerce. Enslaved labor was present in New York households and farms, including the Jays. It is one of the deep ironies of John Jay's life that he grew up in a slaveholding household, yet later became a key figure in the gradual abolition of slavery in New York. The young boy's daily exposure to enslaved people, treated as property in a Christian household, raised questions he would only fully confront decades later. Education, however, was his first calling. From an early age, it was clear that John was thoughtful and disciplined. He was initially educated at home, under tutors, a common practice among families of means in mid-18th century New York. The curriculum was shaped by classical learning, Latin and Greek, the Bible, moral philosophy. This was not education for amusement, it was training for a life of responsibility. In 1760, at about the age of 14 or 15, Jay entered King's College in New York, the institution that would later become Columbia University. King's was an Anglican foundation, created in part to counterbalance the influence of Presbyterian and Congregational colleges in New England. It emphasized classical education, moral philosophy, and loyalty to the British Constitution as then understood. At King's, Jay studied under Dr. Samuel Johnson, the president of the college, and a man steeped in both classical and Christian learning. Johnson believed education should form not only the mind, but the character. The student body was small, instruction was intense, students and tutors interacted closely. The environment cultivated a habit of disciplined thinking that would mark Jay's later legal and diplomatic work. In these years, Jay absorbed the staples of Enlightenment-era education, the classics of Greece and Rome, the philosophy of natural law, and the British constitutional tradition. He read the histories of ancient republics and the arguments of thinkers who wrestled with the tension between authority and liberty. This intellectual formation would prove critical when, within a decade, the stability of Britain's relationship with her colonies began to crack. Though a quiet and reserved young man by temperament, Jay distinguished himself as serious, conscientious, and capable. There is no record of him as a fiery orator at this stage. Rather, he earned respect through diligence and careful reasoning. In an age that increasingly rewarded rhetoric and pamphleteering, he would remain throughout his life more inclined to measured argument than to emotional display. Jay graduated from King's College in 1764. At just 19, he had behind him a thorough classical education, strong family connections, and a reputation for integrity and intelligence. The next step was the law, a profession that, in colonial New York, served as a bridge between private interest and public life. It was through the law that Jay would move more directly into the public sphere, even as he initially tried to steer a course of order and moderation in an increasingly turbulent time. As he left King's College in 1764, there was little to indicate that this quiet, studious young man would become one of the principal architects of a new nation. Yet the essentials were already present. A religious seriousness inherited from Huguenot ancestors, an attachment to law and order, and a mind trained to balance principle with prudence. The world around him was changing quickly. The question was how John Jay would respond when history came knocking. Chapter 2, From Lawyer to Patriot, 1765 and 1775. Upon graduating in 1764, John Jay turned decisively toward the law. He entered the office of Benjamin Kissam, a respected New York attorney. Legal training at the time was not conducted in formal law schools, but through apprenticeship. Young men read law under established lawyers, copying documents, studying cases, and learning the intricate procedures of colonial courts. Kissam's office exposed Jay to the practical realities of law in a British colony. Property disputes, commercial conflicts, maritime issues, and the daily business of a society built on written contracts and inherited customs. Jay's temperament fit this world. He was methodical, attentive to detail, and deeply concerned with fairness as defined by law. In 1768, after several years of training, he was admitted to the bar and began practice. These were also the years in which the relationship between Britain and her American colonies began to deteriorate. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. imposing direct taxes on the colonies for the first time in a way that many colonists found deeply objectionable. New York, as a commercial center, felt the effects acutely. Merchants, printers, and lawyers all relied on stamped paper. Jay was in his early 20s during the Stamp Act crisis. While later recollections suggest he was not among the most radical voices, he was watching and learning. The central question, what authority did Parliament have over the colonies, and what rights did the colonists possess as Englishmen, was squarely in the domain of law. Jay absorbed the debates, internalizing both the colonists' arguments about rights and the risks of open confrontation with the Crown. By the early 1770s, Jay had built a successful legal practice. His clients included merchants and landowners, and his reputation for clear thinking and integrity was growing. He married Sarah Van Brugh Livingston on April 28, 1774, the daughter of William Livingston, a prominent New Jersey lawyer and future governor of that state. This marriage connected Jay to one of the most politically active families in the region. Sarah herself was highly intelligent, well-read, and politically aware. Their partnership would be one of mutual respect and shared commitment to public affairs. The imperial crisis intensified with the Tea Act of 1773 and the Boston Tea Party, then the punitive, coercive, intolerable acts in 1774. New York's political elite had to decide how to respond. Jay, by nature cautious and legalistic, did not rush into radicalism. He believed in the British constitutional tradition and hoped initially that reasonable protest could bring redress. In the summer of 1774, New York convened a committee of correspondence and later a provincial congress to coordinate with other colonies. Jay was drawn into these emerging political structures. His reputation made him a natural choice for drafting documents. That year, at only 28, he was chosen as one of New York's delegates to the First Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia beginning in September 1774. At the First Continental Congress, Jay found himself among men who would soon be known as the Founding Fathers: George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and others. While some arrived ready for confrontation, many, like Jay, hoped for reconciliation on terms consistent with colonial rights. Jay played a key role in drafting the Address to the People of Great Britain in 1774, a document that carefully laid out colonial grievances while still professing loyalty to the king. This document reveals much about Jay's early political stance. It is clear, reasoned, and respectful in tone, but firm in substance. The colonists, it argued, were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen in Britain, particularly the right not to be taxed without their own consent through their own representatives. The address was a plea for understanding and a warning that continued abuses would drive the colonies toward more drastic measures. The balance of respect and principle in this writing is characteristic of Jay. When the Second Continental Congress convened in 1775, after blood had been shed at Lexington and Concord, Jay attended again as a delegate from New York. The situation had darkened. Yet even now he tried initially to preserve the possibility of reconciliation. Over time, however, it became clear that the gap between Parliament's claims and the colonies' understanding of their rights was too wide to bridge. Back in New York, Jay was increasingly involved in local revolutionary organization. He served on New York's Committee of Correspondence and later on the Committee of Safety, bodies that effectively began to assume governing powers as royal authority crumbled. He was recognized as a key draftsman and advisor, more often wielding the pen than the sword. Jay's transition from loyal subject to American patriot was not impulsive. It was the product of legal and constitutional reasoning. As Parliament insisted on its unlimited authority over the colonies, and as the Crown backed policies that trampled what Jay saw as fundamental rights, he concluded that continued loyalty on those terms was impossible. The British Constitution, in his understanding, was not a blank check for power. It was a balanced system meant to secure liberty under law. If that balance was destroyed, allegiance had to be reconsidered. Yet Jay never embraced the rhetoric of unbounded popular sovereignty. He believed strongly in order, property rights, and the rule of law. This would keep him, throughout the Revolutionary period, somewhat at odds with the more radical democratic elements that emerged in New York politics. He distrusted mob action and extra-legal violence, even when it was deployed in the patriot cause. His revolution would be one conducted through representative assemblies, written constitutions, and formal procedures. In 1775 and 1776, as the crisis accelerated and the Continental Congress moved steadily toward independence, Jay's responsibilities multiplied. He prepared reports, drafted resolutions, and worked behind the scenes to shape policy. Although he was not among the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he supported the move once it became clear that reconciliation on just terms was impossible. By 1775, then, John Jay had completed the crucial shift from promising young lawyer within the British imperial system to committed American patriot, prepared to help build new political institutions in New York and beyond. As war loomed and then broke out, his skills as a constitutional thinker and careful drafter would soon be called upon for one of his greatest achievements, the creation of a new fundamental law for his home state. Chapter 3. Pen and Purpose in Revolution, 1775-1778. The outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775 transformed the nature of John Jay's work. The struggle was no longer only about petitions and addresses. It was about organizing resistance, securing resources, and constructing new governments in the vacuum left by collapsing royal authority. In New York, the situation was particularly complex. The colony was deeply divided, with strong loyalist sentiment, critical strategic ports, and a mixed population. New York City itself would eventually become a British stronghold. Jay's cautious temperament and commitment to lawful order made him an influential figure in navigating this dangerous transition. By 1776, Jay was serving in the New York Provincial Congress, the body that acted as a revolutionary legislature after royal authority unraveled. That summer, as the Continental Congress in Philadelphia adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, the New York Provincial Congress faced its own monumental task, writing a state constitution. Jay was placed at the center of this effort. In the months that followed, he drafted much of what would become the Constitution of the State of New York, completed in April 1777. This document is one of Jay's most significant contributions to American political development. The New York Constitution of 1777 reflected Jay's desire to balance liberty with stability. It established a bicameral legislature with a Senate and an Assembly and a strong executive in the form of a governor. It also created a Council of Revision, composed of the governor, the chancellor, and the judges of the Supreme Court, with power to review and return bills to the legislature. This mechanism, which Jay supported, was an early experiment in checking legislative power, a concept that would later echo in the federal system's checks and balances. The Constitution also included a Declaration of Rights, affirming protections for jury trials, freedom of religion within the bounds of Protestantism, later broadened in practice, and other liberties. It was not a radical democratic document. Property qualifications for voting and office holding remained. Jay believed in filtered representation, with some distance between transient popular moods and the making of laws. Yet, in asserting the people of New York as the source of political authority and in providing a written fundamental law, it marked a profound break from the old imperial system. While drafting and debating the Constitution, Jay and his colleagues had to do so under the shadow of war. In 1776, British forces captured New York City after the Battle of Long Island, and the city remained under British control for the rest of the war. The provincial Congress and later the government of New York operated in exile in places like Kingston and Poughkeepsie. Jay's work took place amid uncertainty about the very survival of the revolutionary cause. When the New York Constitution was adopted in April 1777, Jay soon moved into judicial and executive roles under the new government. In May 1777, he was appointed the first Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court of Judicature. This position placed him at the head of the state's highest court at a time when the line between civil justice and wartime security was thin. As Chief Justice, Jay confronted the problem of loyalists, those who remained attached to the British Crown and, in many cases, actively aided British military efforts. New York's divisions ran deep. The Jay Court had to adjudicate cases involving property confiscations, treason charges, and the legal status of those who had taken up arms or lent support to the enemy. Jay's decisions and opinions in this period reflect his attempt to hold the line between necessary wartime measures and arbitrary vengeance. One famous episode from these years occurred in 1776-1777, when Jay was involved in uncovering and addressing a plot against General George Washington. While serving on New York's Committee of Safety and examining various threats, Jay and his colleagues became aware of conspiracies by loyalists and agents attempting to undermine American military leadership. Although the historical record does not present Jay as the sole discoverer or foil of these plots, his role on the Committee of Safety placed him at the center of efforts to secure the revolutionary cause against internal enemies. These experiences deepened Jay's awareness of the fragility of Republican government in times of crisis. He saw how easily fear and anger could lead to abuses of power, and he worked to maintain due process where possible, even as he accepted that some extraordinary measures were required in a war for independence. At the same time, Jay continued to serve in the Continental Congress. In December 1778, he was elected President of the Continental Congress, a role he held until September 1779. The presidency of Congress was largely a presiding and coordinating role, rather than an executive office in the modern sense. But it was important for maintaining order in debates and communications among the states and with foreign powers. As President of Congress, Jay had to manage tensions among the states, logistical difficulties in supplying the Continental Army, and the ongoing search for foreign assistance. He was a strong supporter of General Washington and of efforts to maintain a unified national front. The experience convinced him that the loose confederation of states under the Articles of Confederation, then being finalized and ratified, was inadequate for the long-term needs of the new nation. During these years, 1775 to 1778, Jay's life was one of near constant movement between roles. He was at once a state constitutional drafter, a Chief Justice, a member and then President of the Continental Congress, and a key figure in intelligence and security matters in New York. His personal life was marked by the strains of war, separation from his wife Sarah for long periods, the danger of travel, and the uncertainty of income as normal legal practice was disrupted. Yet despite these challenges, Jay's core principles remained visible. He insisted on written constitutions, formal procedures, and legal constraints even in the extraordinary circumstances of revolution. He was no advocate of unbounded popular will. He believed that liberty must operate within a structure of law and order. This insistence made him, in the eyes of some, overly conservative, but it also laid important foundations for the later stability of both New York and the United States. By 1778, with the war still far from decided and the American finances in disarray, Congress turned to a new phase of the struggle: diplomacy. The rebellion needed recognition, loans, and alliances from European powers. It was in this realm, negotiating with Old World monarchies for the survival of a New World republic, that John Jay would soon be called to serve. Chapter 4. Diplomat in a World at War, 1779 to 1783. By 1779, the American Revolution had entered a diplomatic phase as critical as any battle. Military victories such as Saratoga in 1777 and the French alliance in 1778 were encouraging, but the young republic remained financially fragile and diplomatically precarious. Congress needed skilled negotiators who could navigate the courts of Europe, secure loans, and eventually negotiate peace. In September 1779, the Continental Congress chose John Jay as minister plenipotentiary to Spain. The choice reflected his reputation for integrity, prudence, and clear-headed constitutional thinking. Spain, although hostile to Britain and an ally of France under the Treaty of Aranjuez, 1779, was wary of the American Revolution. The Spanish crown worried that a successful colonial rebellion might encourage uprisings in its own vast American empire. Jay left for Europe in October 1779, traveling with his wife Sarah and their young child on a French frigate. The voyage was perilous. The Atlantic in wartime was patrolled by enemy ships and plagued by storms. Jay fell seriously ill during the crossing, and at one point the ship was driven off course and forced to put in at Martinique in the Caribbean before finally reaching Cadiz, Spain, in January 1780. Once in Spain, Jay faced immediate challenges. He had no formal recognition as a minister. The Spanish court at Aranjuez and Madrid stalled, reluctant to acknowledge the United States openly. Spain shared France's interest in weakening Britain, but opposed American claims to the Mississippi River and the Western lands, which Spain coveted for its own empire. Jay's mission was to secure Spanish recognition, loans, and perhaps direct military or naval assistance. The odds were not in his favor. For nearly 2 years, from 1780 to 1782, Jay labored in Spain with limited success. He met with Spanish officials, including the foreign minister José Moñino, Count of Floridablanca, but was repeatedly rebuffed in his requests for formal recognition. Jay's dispatches back to Congress paint a picture of persistent but frustrating efforts to convince Spain that the United States was a durable, reliable partner. Financially, the situation was dire. Congress instructed Jay to secure loans, and he tried to raise money through bills of exchange drawn on American credit. These efforts were fraught with uncertainty, as American credit in European markets was shaky. Jay was often short of money for his own household, compelled to juggle limited funds while supporting his diplomatic staff and family. At certain points, he even had to borrow money personally to keep his mission afloat. Yet the mission was not entirely fruitless. Spain did provide some covert aid, and Jay's presence helped keep open channels of communication between the American cause and the Spanish court. He also gained valuable experience in European diplomacy, the protocols, the personalities, the slow, deliberate pace of negotiation in an absolutist court. In 1782, a new opportunity arose. Negotiations for a general peace between Britain and its enemies were taking shape in Paris. Congress appointed a team of American commissioners to negotiate a peace treaty with Britain. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Henry Laurens, and later Thomas Jefferson, though Jefferson did not ultimately participate in the final negotiations. Jay was called from Spain to join these discussions in Paris. Jay arrived in Paris in June 1782. The city was a hub of diplomatic activity, filled with envoys, spies, and agents of various powers. Franklin had already established himself as a towering figure at the French court, beloved by many in Parisian society. Adams brought a forceful New England intensity to the table. Jay, in contrast, was quieter, more reserved, but no less determined. The central challenge in Paris was to negotiate an acceptable peace with Britain while coordinating with France, America's formal ally under the Treaty of Alliance of 1778. The French foreign minister, Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, had his own objectives, weakening Britain, but also preventing the United States from becoming too strong and potentially threatening French or Spanish interests. Jay quickly came to suspect that France's aims did not fully align with America's on important issues, especially Western boundaries and fishing rights. He believed that Vergennes was willing to sacrifice some American claims to accommodate Spain and to maintain a balance of power favorable to France. In particular, the question of access to the Mississippi River and the extent of American territory in the West were contentious. A turning point came when Jay met with the British envoy, Richard Oswald, and saw a draft of the British Peace Commission that described the Americans as colonies. Jay insisted that the United States must be treated as an independent nation in all official documents and that negotiations must proceed on that basis. He refused to negotiate under any lesser designation. Congress's instructions, however, had bound the American commissioners to act in concert with France and not to conclude a peace without French knowledge and agreement. Jay, convinced that French mediation was compromising American interests, took a bold step. He joined with Adams and eventually Franklin in negotiating directly and secretly with the British without fully informing Vergennes of the content and pace of talks. This decision has been debated by historians and was controversial even at the time, yet it proved decisive. In a series of negotiations through the latter half of 1782, Jay and his fellow commissioners worked out the outlines of what would become the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Jay was particularly insistent on securing recognition of American independence by Britain, generous western boundaries extending U.S. territory to the Mississippi River, fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, provisions for the evacuation of British forces and the restitution or consideration of Loyalist property claims. On November 30, 1782, the Americans and British signed preliminary articles of peace. These articles granted the United States extraordinarily favorable terms, especially in regard to territory. Jay's firmness on the issue of boundaries and equality of status helped secure this outcome. The formal Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, and ratified in 1784, officially ending the war. The Treaty of Paris marked the successful end of the American struggle for independence and stands as one of Jay's crowning achievements. His role demonstrated his capacity for strategic thinking and his willingness, when he deemed it necessary, to deviate from strict instructions in pursuit of the nation's fundamental interests. For Jay personally, the years 1779 to 1783 were transformational. He had moved from the courts of New York to the courts of Europe, navigated royal intrigues and alliance politics, and helped secure a peace that exceeded many expectations. He returned to America in 1784 a seasoned diplomat, convinced more than ever that the new nation would need a stronger, more coherent national government to survive in a competitive world. Chapter 5. Forging a Nation on Paper, 1784-1789. When John Jay arrived back in the United States in 1784, the war was officially over, but the hard work of nation-building had only just begun. Under the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, the United States existed as a loose confederation of sovereign states, joined by a weak central Congress with limited powers. In December 1784, Jay was appointed Secretary for Foreign Affairs, in effect, the chief foreign policy officer of the Confederation government. He held this position from 1784 to 1789. The role was critical. He was responsible for managing relations with European powers, handling diplomatic correspondence, and advising Congress on international questions. From the outset, Jay found the Articles of Confederation deeply inadequate. Congress lacked the power to levy taxes directly. It could only request funds from the states, which often failed to meet their obligations. This left the national government perpetually short of money, unable to pay debts or support a credible foreign policy. Treaties made by Congress were sometimes ignored by individual states, undermining American credibility abroad. One example that troubled Jay was the Treaty of Paris, 1783 itself. Its provisions regarding the rights of loyalists and the payment of pre-war debts to British creditors were not consistently honored by state legislatures. At the same time, Britain failed to withdraw fully from some frontier forts in the Northwest, arguing that American violations of the treaty justified its own non-compliance. Jay saw that without a stronger central authority, the United States would struggle to enforce its rights or respect its obligations. As Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Jay wrote a series of reports and letters warning Congress about the dangers of the existing system. In 1786, he famously wrote that the United States needed more energy in the government. He believed that a stronger national government, still Republican and constrained by law, but endowed with real powers, was essential for both domestic order and foreign respect. Meanwhile, events at home underscored these concerns. In 1786-1787, Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, an uprising of indebted farmers protesting taxes and court foreclosures, shocked many leaders, including Jay. He feared that economic distress and weak central authority could lead to anarchy and threaten the very survival of the Republic. It was against this backdrop that the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787 to propose a new framework of government. Jay did not serve as a delegate to the convention. New York was represented by, among others, Alexander Hamilton, John Lansing, Jr., and Robert Yates. But Jay followed the proceedings closely and strongly favored efforts to strengthen the Union. When the convention produced the proposed United States Constitution in September 1787, the battle shifted to the states, where ratification debates would determine whether the new framework would take effect. In New York, opposition was strong. Many feared the loss of state sovereignty and the creation of a distant, powerful central government. It was in this context that Jay was drawn into one of the most famous intellectual campaigns in political history, the Federalist Papers. Beginning in October 1787, a series of essays appeared in New York newspapers under the pseudonym Publius. These were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay to defend the proposed Constitution and to explain its principles to the public. Jay contributed a series of essays, generally regarded as Federalist Nosner 2 through 5, and possibly parts of others, focused particularly on foreign policy and union. In Federalist No. 2, October 31, 1787, Jay argued that the American people were one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, with similar customs and united interests. While this characterization glossed over significant diversity, it was a deliberate rhetorical move, aimed at suggesting that a single united government was both natural and advantageous. In Federalist Nostra 3 and 4, Jay developed a powerful case that union under a strong federal government would better preserve peace and security than a loose confederation or separate sovereignties. He emphasized, a united America would speak with one voice in foreign affairs, avoiding the risk that individual states might provoke wars the others did not want. A national government could more fairly and competently manage treaties, commerce, and defense. Division into multiple confederacies or independent states would invite foreign powers to manipulate rivalries, playing one region against another, a classic strategy of European politics. In Federalist No. 5, Jay drew on historical examples from Britain's own experience, recalling the advantages gained when the kingdoms of England and Scotland united under one government in 1707. The implication was clear. Just as British union had brought greater strength and stability, so too would American union under the new Constitution. Jay's Federalist essays are notable for their calm, reasoned tone. They lack some of the rhetorical fireworks of Hamilton's more sweeping arguments on finance and executive power, but they are grounded in historical examples and diplomatic common sense, precisely the areas in which Jay had deep experience. These essays helped persuade New Yorkers that a stronger union was essential for safety and prosperity in an often hostile world. Despite Jay's efforts, New York's ratification struggle remained contentious. The state convention at Poughkeepsie in 1788 featured fierce debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Ultimately, in July 1788, New York ratified the Constitution, but only narrowly and with proposed amendments. Jay's contributions, both in shaping national policy as Secretary for Foreign Affairs and in articulating arguments in the Federalist, played an important part in that outcome. With the new Constitution ratified and the new federal government forming, Jay's role would soon shift again. The Judiciary Act of 1789, passed by the First Congress, established the federal court system and created the office of Chief Justice of the United States. President George Washington, seeking someone of unquestioned integrity and legal ability to fill this crucial post, turned to Jay. In September 1789, John Jay was nominated and confirmed as the first Chief Justice of the United States. It was a remarkable culmination of his work: lawyer, revolutionary leader, state Chief Justice, diplomat, national foreign affairs official, and now head of the nation's highest court. The next phase of his life would be devoted to giving shape and authority to a judiciary that existed only on paper until he and his colleagues brought it to life. Chapter 6. On the First Bench, Chief Justice of the United States, 1789-1794. When John Jay took the oath as Chief Justice of the United States in 1789, the federal judiciary was an institution largely without precedent in the American experience. The Constitution, 1787-1788, had created the Supreme Court, but it did not define its structure in detail. That task fell to Congress, which passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, organizing the federal court system into district courts, circuit courts, and the Supreme Court. Jay's appointment placed him at the head of a small but symbolically powerful body. The early Supreme Court consisted of 6 justices, 1 Chief Justice, and 5 associate justices. They had to establish not only procedures and norms, but also the authority and dignity of the court in the eyes of the public and the other branches of government. In the early years, the Supreme Court did not immediately take up the role of striking down acts of Congress as unconstitutional, a power later firmly established in Marbury v. Madison, 1803, after Jay's tenure. Instead, the justices spent much of their time riding circuit, traveling long distances to sit as circuit court judges in various regions, hearing a wide range of civil and criminal cases. This was physically demanding work, made more difficult by poor roads, basic accommodations, and harsh weather. Jay approached these duties with his characteristic sense of responsibility. He believed that justice had to be accessible and responsive, and he saw the federal judiciary as an essential pillar of the new constitutional order. Although many of the cases heard during his tenure were not of lasting constitutional significance, they were crucial for establishing federal authority and uniform interpretation of national laws. One of the most significant cases of Jay's term as Chief Justice was Chisholm v. Georgia, 1793. In this case, a South Carolina citizen, Alexander Chisholm, sued the state of Georgia in federal court over a debt. Georgia argued that, as a sovereign state, it could not be sued by an individual without its consent. The Supreme Court, in a landmark decision, ruled in favor of Chisholm, holding that under Article 3 of the Constitution, federal courts had jurisdiction over suits brought by citizens of one state against another state. Jay's opinion emphasized that sovereignty ultimately resided in the people, not in the states as corporate entities, and that the people, in adopting the Constitution, had authorized such suits. Jay wrote that the Constitution was adopted by the people of the United States, and that the states, while important components of the system, were not sovereign in the old monarchical sense. He saw the federal judiciary as an instrument through which the people could secure justice even against state governments. The reaction to Chisholm v. Georgia was swift and intense. Many states were alarmed at the prospect of being hauled into federal court by individual plaintiffs, particularly in cases involving debts. The decision was perceived as a threat to state sovereignty and financial stability. In response, Congress proposed the 11th Amendment, which was ratified in 1795, limiting the federal judicial power by prohibiting suits against a state by citizens of another state or foreign country. The amendment effectively overturned Chisholm, and in doing so, demonstrated an important feature of the new constitutional system: the dialogue between the branches and the people, with amendments serving as a mechanism for correcting or refining the court's interpretations. Jay's opinion had advanced a robust view of national judicial authority. The people and the states, through the amendment process, drew a line he had not. Even as he served as Chief Justice, Jay was drawn into other national responsibilities. In 1790, President Washington asked him to help resolve a dispute between New York and New Hampshire over the territory of Vermont. Jay's experience as a negotiator and constitutional thinker made him a natural choice for this kind of arbitration. In 1792, the presidential election produced an unusual situation. Some electors cast their second votes, after George Washington, for John Jay, giving him a small number of electoral votes for vice president. Though he did not come close to being elected, the votes reflected Jay's standing among some Federalist circles as a respected national leader. As Chief Justice, Jay continued to support a strong national government and a judiciary capable of enforcing federal laws and treaties. He was closely aligned with the Federalist Party, particularly with Alexander Hamilton, whose financial program and broad interpretation of federal power Jay generally favored. This political alignment would soon propel him into one of the most controversial roles of his career. By the early 1790s, relations between the United States and Great Britain had deteriorated. Britain remained in possession of several forts in the Northwest Territory, contrary to the Treaty of Paris, 1783. British naval forces were also seizing American ships engaged in trade with France, as Britain and Revolutionary France were at war following the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1792. Many Americans, especially those sympathetic to France, called for retaliation or even war. President Washington, seeking to avoid war and protect American commerce, decided in 1794 to send a special envoy to Britain to negotiate a settlement. For this delicate mission, he chose John Jay. The appointment was controversial from the start. Critics feared that a staunch Federalist and sitting Chief Justice might sacrifice American interests to maintain good relations with Britain. Supporters believed his reputation and moderation made him ideal. Jay accepted the mission and sailed for England in 1794, temporarily leaving his judicial duties behind. The result would be the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation, more commonly known as the Jay Treaty of 1794, a treaty that would ignite one of the fiercest political storms of the early Republic. Chapter 7. A Controversial Peace, the Jay Treaty, 1794-1795. When John Jay arrived in London in 1794, he entered a capital preoccupied with war against revolutionary France and wary of the young American Republic. The United States, officially neutral in the European conflict, was caught between its former enemy, Britain, and its revolutionary ally, France. American ships traded with both sides, and Britain, seeking to choke off French commerce, often seized neutral vessels, including American ones, on the high seas. The list of American grievances against Britain by 1794 was long. Britain had retained military posts in the Northwest Territory, contrary to the Treaty of Paris, 1783. British agents in these regions were accused of encouraging Native American resistance to American expansion. The Royal Navy was seizing American merchant ships, especially those trading with the French West Indies. American merchants demanded compensation for these seizures, and some clamored for retaliation. At home, American politics were polarizing. Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, favored closer commercial ties with Britain and a strong central government. Democratic Republicans, associated with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, sympathized more with France and feared Federalist leanings toward Britain and aristocracy. Jay, a committed Federalist, became a lightning rod for this partisan divide. In London, Jay's task was to avoid war and secure American rights without abandoning neutrality or surrendering core interests. He began talks with William Grenville, the British Foreign Secretary. The negotiations touched on a range of contentious issues. 5. Evacuation of Western forts. The British had promised in 1783 to vacate forts located in territory acknowledged as American. Their continued presence violated American sovereignty and emboldened native resistance. 6. Debts and loyalists. Britain insisted that pre-war debts owed by Americans to British creditors be honored, and that confiscated property of loyalists receive some form of consideration. 7. Maritime issues. American merchants wanted compensation for ships and cargoes seized by British cruisers. The United States also wanted to restrict Britain's right to search American vessels and impress sailors. 8. Commercial relations. Both sides had an interest in clarifying trade arrangements, especially in the West Indies and other colonial markets. The resulting Jay Treaty, signed on November 19, 1794, was a complex compromise. Among its key provisions, Britain agreed to evacuate the northwestern forts, such as those at Detroit, Niagara, and others, by 1796, finally implementing parts of the 1783 peace settlement. A series of mixed commissions were created to adjudicate disputes over boundaries, pre-war debts, and claims resulting from maritime seizures. American merchants were promised limited access to certain British colonial ports in the Caribbean, though on terms many Americans found restrictive. The treaty did not secure a clear British renunciation of impressment, nor did it fully resolve all neutral rights issues. From a diplomatic standpoint, the treaty was a peace-preserving arrangement that regularized Anglo-American relations and removed a significant British military presence from U.S. soil. It also gave American commerce some predictable access to British markets. But from a political standpoint back home, it was explosive. News of the Jay Treaty reached the United States in 1795 and soon became public. Critics denounced it as a betrayal. Democratic Republicans, and even some who were not ardent partisans, saw it as too conciliatory to Britain, too harsh on France, and insufficiently protective of American sovereignty. The treaty's perceived failures regarding impressment and neutral rights were particularly galling. Jay himself became the object of intense public anger. Effigies of him were burned in American cities. In New York, a crowd reportedly marched with a banner reading, "Damn John Jay, damn everyone that won't damn John Jay. Damn everyone that won't put lights in their windows and sit up all night damning John Jay." The rhetoric may have been exaggerated in later retellings, but the depth of opposition was real. Yet defenders of the treaty, including Hamilton and President George Washington, argued that it was the best that could be obtained in the circumstances. Britain was a powerful empire, at war with France. The United States was a weak, indebted republic with a small navy and army. Jay, they maintained, had preserved peace, secured evacuation of forts, and provided a legal framework for handling claims and disputes. In the Senate, which under the Constitution had to consent to treaties, the Jay Treaty provoked fierce debate. In June 1795, the Senate narrowly approved it, by the necessary two-thirds majority, but only after striking one article related to West Indian trade. President Washington, despite his own misgivings about some aspects, decided to ratify the treaty in August 1795, after Britain agreed to suspend certain offensive provisions of its own maritime policy, notably an order concerning neutral trade with the French West Indies. Over time, the practical effects of the Jay Treaty were significant. Britain did indeed withdraw from the western forts by 1796, reducing one major source of tension and opening the way for American settlement and administration in the Northwest Territory. Anglo-American trade expanded considerably in the late 1790s, contributing to American economic growth. The treaty helped the United States avoid war with Britain at a vulnerable moment, giving the young republic time to strengthen its institutions. Nonetheless, the domestic political cost was high. The treaty became a rallying point for the Democratic-Republican opposition and deepened partisan divides. Jay, for his part, remained convinced that he had acted in the nation's best interest, within the constraints of reality. He saw the preservation of peace and the orderly settlement of disputes as essential. Ironically, while Jay was still in London negotiating, he was elected governor of New York in April 1795. The voters of his home state, many of whom were Federalists or moderate supporters of order and stability, chose him despite the brewing controversy. When he returned to the United States, he found himself both the most vilified man in some parts of the country and the newly elected executive of one of its most important states. In June 1795, Jay resigned as Chief Justice of the United States to take up the governorship. His time on the national bench had been short but foundational. His time as governor would see him apply his principles to pressing domestic issues, including one that contrasted sharply with his youth in a slaveholding household: the gradual abolition of slavery in New York. Chapter 8. Governor in a Time of Upheaval, 1795–1801. John Jay assumed office as governor of New York in July 1795 at a moment of intense partisan conflict and rapid social change. The state was one of the most populous and economically significant in the Union, with a diverse population, growing commercial centers like New York City, and a large rural hinterland. As governor, Jay brought the same orderly, legalistic mindset that had characterized his previous roles. He saw the governor's office as a constitutional position, bound to uphold laws and maintain stability rather than to cater to transient passions. New York politics, however, were anything but tranquil. Factional battles between Federalists and Democratic Republicans played out in elections, newspapers, and legislative struggles. One of the most consequential issues Jay confronted as governor was slavery. New York, like many northern states, had a substantial enslaved population in the 18th century, especially in rural areas and in households of the urban elite. Jay himself had grown up in a slaveholding family and earlier in his life had owned enslaved people. Over time, however, his religious convictions and evolving views led him into the anti-slavery movement. Jay's opposition to slavery had emerged decades earlier. As early as the 1770s and 1780s, he had been associated with anti-slavery societies in New York and had spoken and written against the institution. He advocated gradual emancipation, arguing that slavery was morally wrong, but that its end should be managed in a way that avoided social chaos and protected the interests of both formerly enslaved people and the broader community. By the time he became governor, the groundwork for abolition in New York had already been laid through public debate and legislative proposals. But progress had been slow and frequently blocked. Jay used his position to support and sign a key piece of legislation, the New York Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, passed in 1799. The 1799 law did not abolish slavery at once. Instead, it provided that children born to enslaved mothers after July 4, 1799, would be legally free, but bound to serve the mother's master as indentured servants until age 28, males, or 25, females. Enslaved people already in bondage before that date remained enslaved for life, unless manumitted by their owners under specified conditions. By modern standards, this act was cautious and incomplete. It left many people in slavery for years and created a class of long-term indentured servants. but in the context of the late 18th century, it was a substantial step. It set New York on a legal path that would ultimately lead to the final abolition of slavery in the state by 1827, after Jay's time as governor, but in line with the trajectory he had helped establish. Jay saw this law as a moral imperative compatible with safety and order. His own religious beliefs, influenced by his Huguenot background and later by a deep personal piety, were central to this stance. He regarded slavery as incompatible with Christian ethics and Republican values. His insistence on a legal, structured process for ending it was rooted in his lifelong concern to avoid violence and upheaval. As governor, Jay also addressed issues related to judicial reform, public order, and education. He supported measures to improve the administration of justice and to maintain social stability in a period still marked by the aftershocks of revolution and the ongoing political struggles of the 1790s. His style was not charismatic. He was a man of letters, law, and administration, rather than a popular stump speaker. Yet his reputation for honesty and steadiness earned him respect. Politically, Jay remained aligned with the Federalist Party, supporting the administrations of George Washington and John Adams at the national level. The late 1790s saw the rise of fierce controversies over foreign policy, especially during the quasi-war with France, 1798-1800, an undeclared naval conflict. Jay, committed to neutrality and order, favored policies that avoided war and maintained internal stability, even as partisan rhetoric grew bitter. In 1798, Jay was re-elected governor of New York, a sign that despite the lingering controversy over the Jay Treaty, he maintained substantial support in his home state. Yet by the turn of the century, the political winds were shifting. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, were gaining strength nationally, capitalizing on public discontent with Federalist policies such as the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Jay, weary and increasingly disillusioned with the tone of public affairs, decided not to seek another term. He left the governor's office in 1801. That same year, after the fiercely contested presidential election of 1800, the Federalists lost control of the national government and Thomas Jefferson became president. The Federalist era, during which Jay had been a central figure in law and diplomacy, was passing. Interestingly, in 1800, outgoing President John Adams nominated Jay once again to be Chief Justice of the United States after Oliver Ellsworth resigned. The Senate confirmed the appointment. Jay, however, declined. In a letter dated January 1801, he explained that he doubted the court would, in its then weak institutional position, command the necessary respect and energy within the government. He was also in poor health and ready to retire from the grind of public office. With his refusal of this second opportunity to lead the Supreme Court, Jay effectively closed the chapter of his active political and judicial career. He retired to his estate at Bedford, in Westchester County, New York, where he would spend the remaining decades of his life in relative quiet, yet still engaged intellectually and morally with the fate of the republic he had done so much to build. Chapter 9. Retreat to Bedford, Faith, Family, and Correspondence, 1801-1829. In 1801, John Jay withdrew from public office and returned to his estate near Bedford, New York. The estate, acquired earlier in his life, became a place of family life, agricultural management, reading, and correspondence. For a man who had spent decades in the center of revolutionary diplomatic and judicial struggles, the change was profound. Jay's retirement did not mean disengagement from public affairs. He remained a careful observer of politics and an active correspondent with former colleagues. One of the most interesting dimensions of his later years is found in his letters, which reveal his views on the evolving republic, his religious convictions, and his reflections on the events he had helped shape. Jay's correspondence with John Adams, for example, sheds light on the thinking of two leading Federalists whose public careers had largely ended. In letters exchanged in the 1810s and 1820s, they discussed the state of American politics, the French Revolution and its aftermath, and the nature of Republican government. Both men had become wary of extremes, whether of unrestrained democracy or authoritarian reaction. They also shared a deepening religious seriousness that informed their judgments. Jay's religious faith, always important to him, became even more central in his later years. He was a devoted Anglican and, after the American Revolution, an Episcopalian, and he saw the hand of Providence in the survival and growth of the United States. He supported efforts to distribute the Bible and promote Christian education, believing that religion was essential for the moral foundation of a free society. One of his notable contributions in this sphere was his involvement with the American Bible Society, founded in 1816. Jay served as its first president. The Society's mission was to publish and distribute Bibles widely, both in the United States and abroad. For Jay, this work was not merely a private religious commitment, it was a civic one. He believed that citizens acquainted with Scripture would be better able to uphold virtue and Republican self-government. Jay's later years also saw him reflecting on slavery and its gradual demise in New York. The state's final emancipation date, set by legislation passed after his governorship, came in 1827, when slavery was formally abolished in New York. Jay, who had helped initiate the legal process of gradual abolition with the 1799 Act, could see in this development the fruition of seeds he had helped plant decades earlier. On his Bedford estate, Jay lived with and near family members, including his children and their spouses. His son William Jay would become an important figure in the 19th century anti-slavery movement, a development that can be seen as a continuation of John Jay's moral and legal legacy on the issue. The household and its surroundings became a kind of federalist and religious enclave where conversations about law, politics, and theology continued, even if the wider political world had moved in more democratic and partisan directions. Physically, Jay's health declined with age. He had suffered a stroke in 1801, not long after leaving office as governor, which left him with some lasting impairments and reinforced his decision to avoid further public office. Yet he lived on for nearly 3 more decades, his mind engaged even as his body weakened. He followed major national events with interest and sometimes with concern. The War of 1812 against Britain, 1812-1815, which he had hoped could be avoided. The rise of new political leaders like James Monroe and John Quincy Adams. The ongoing debates over internal improvements, tariffs, and the balance of power between states and the federal government. Jay did not return to public office, nor did he seek to become a public commentator in the style of some of his contemporaries. He wrote selectively, choosing his interventions carefully. His temperament remained one of measured judgment and a preference for considered action over rhetoric. For students of history, the significance of his later years lies less in any specific political initiative and more in the consistency of his principles and his quiet but steady influence on the next generation, especially through family and church networks. On May 17, 1829, John Jay died at his Bedford home at the age of 83. His passing marked the end of a life that had spanned the transformation of Britain's North American colonies into an independent republic and then into an expanding nation, stretching westward and grappling with the unresolved tensions of slavery and sectionalism. Many of his peers, Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, were already gone. Others, like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, had died 3 years earlier, famously both on July 4, 1826. Jay's funeral and immediate remembrance were respectful, but relatively muted compared to the grand commemorations accorded some other founders. This was fitting, in a sense, for a man whose contributions were often made in committee rooms, court chambers, and negotiating salons rather than on battlefields or in mass rallies. Yet his influence would endure in institutions, legal doctrines, treaties, and the quieter currents of moral and religious life. As the 19th century progressed, Jay's public reputation receded somewhat, overshadowed by more dramatic personalities. But for those who looked closely at the architecture of American diplomacy, constitutional law, and the early movement against slavery in the North, his presence remained unmistakable. A reminder that republics are not built only by orators and generals, but also by careful, principled craftsmen of law and policy. Chapter 10. Legacy of a Reluctant Founder. Assessing the legacy of John Jay, 1745–1829, requires attention to the often hidden infrastructure of a republic, its laws, treaties, courts, and moral assumptions. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Jay did not leave behind a dramatic story of battlefield glory or presidential leadership. Instead, he left institutions, texts, and precedents, the quiet architecture that undergirds public life. First, consider his role as a constitutional craftsman. Jay was a principal author of the New York Constitution of 1777, a document that balanced legislative authority with executive power and judicial oversight. Its Council of Revision anticipated later American concerns about checking legislative excess, and its protections for religious freedom and trial by jury helped set patterns for state constitutions elsewhere. In his insistence that constitutions be written, enforceable, and above ordinary law, Jay helped entrench the idea of fundamental law as a cornerstone of American political thought. At the national level, Jay's contributions to the Federalist Papers, 1787–1788, especially essays 2 through 5, shaped ideas about union and foreign policy. His arguments that the United States would be safer, more respected, and more prosperous as a single united republic than as a collection of rival confederacies remain influential. In a world where external threats and foreign entanglements were inevitable, Jay argued that only a strong federal government could negotiate and enforce treaties, regulate commerce, and present a coherent face to other powers. Second, as a diplomat, Jay played a central role in securing the international position of the United States at two crucial junctures. In Paris, 1782–1783, he was one of the principal negotiators of the Treaty of Paris, which not only ended the Revolutionary War, but secured remarkably favorable boundaries for the new republic, extending its reach to the Mississippi River and ensuring access to vital fisheries. His insistence that Britain recognize American independence explicitly and deal with the United States as a sovereign equal was a decisive assertion of national dignity. In London, 1794, with the Jay Treaty, he again helped steer the young republic away from a war it was ill-prepared to fight. While deeply controversial at home, the treaty preserved peace, secured the evacuation of British frontier forts, and regularized trade relations, giving the United States time to consolidate its institutions and economy. Historians continue to debate whether better terms could have been obtained, but few dispute that the treaty played a major role in stabilizing Anglo-American relations in the 1790s. Third, Jay's tenure as first Chief Justice of the United States, 1789–1795, contributed to the early shaping of the federal judiciary. The court under his leadership was still in its infancy, and its decisions did not yet routinely address high constitutional questions. But cases like Chisholm v. Georgia, 1793, illustrated Jay's vision of a national judiciary empowered to enforce the rights of individuals even against states, rooted in the idea that sovereignty ultimately resides with the people of the United States as a whole. Although the 11th Amendment, 1795, rolled back the scope of that decision, the episode demonstrated the dynamic nature of American constitutionalism. Courts, legislatures, and the people, through amendments, in conversation and tension. Jay's willingness to articulate a robust national vision for the judiciary helped set the stage for its later development. Fourth, Jay's legacy in anti-slavery efforts and gradual emancipation in New York reflects a moral dimension of his statesmanship. Growing up in a slave-holding environment, he nonetheless came to see slavery as incompatible with Christian and Republican principles. His leadership in the New York Manumission Society and his support for and signing of the 1799 New York Act for the gradual abolition of slavery positioned him as a key legal architect of slavery's demise in his state. The process was far from immediate or complete in his lifetime. Yet by the time slavery was finally abolished in New York in 1827, Jay's early advocacy and the legal framework he helped establish had played a crucial role. His son William Jay and other descendants continued the anti-slavery cause, carrying forward a family legacy of reform that linked the founding generation to the antebellum abolitionist movement. Fifth, Jay's example illustrates the importance of character and restraint in leadership. Throughout his career, he was noted for personal integrity. Even political opponents often acknowledged his honesty and incorruptibility. Moderation. He avoided extremes, sought legal and institutional solutions, and resisted the temptations of demagoguery. Religious conviction. Rather than retreating into private piety, he saw his faith as informing his public duties, particularly in questions of justice, liberty of conscience, and human bondage. In an age of swirling passions, revolution, counter-revolution, partisan warfare, Jay's steadiness helped preserve institutional continuity. One might say that he typified what could be called a conservative revolutionary, a man willing to break with imperial authority and build a republic, but determined to do so through law, deliberation, and respect for order. Finally, Jay's relative obscurity in popular memory raises questions about how we remember the founders. Figures like Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Franklin often dominate the narrative, in part because their roles were more visible or dramatic. Jay's work was more often behind the scenes, crafting a constitution, drafting an address, negotiating a treaty, rendering a judicial opinion. His life reminds us that nation-building is as much about careful writing, negotiation, and legal interpretation as it is about speeches and battles. For students in a coffee shop or listeners on a park bench, the story of John Jay offers several enduring lessons. That institutions matter, and that wise design at the outset can shape political life for generations. That foreign policy and domestic structure are inseparable. A weak or divided union invites danger from abroad. That moral convictions can, over time, reshape legal orders, as with gradual emancipation in New York. And that a republic needs not only heroes of action, but guardians of law, who see their work not as self-glorification, but as service. John Jay never sought the limelight. He declined opportunities, such as a second term as Chief Justice, when he believed his health or the institutional conditions were not right. He often described his own ambitions in modest terms and preferred the company of family, books, and fields at Bedford to the noise of crowded assemblies. Yet from his birth in 1745 in a colonial merchant household, through revolution, diplomacy, constitutional formation, judicial leadership, and gubernatorial reform, until his death in 1829, he contributed decisively to the framework of American life. In the careful measure of his words, the firmness of his principles, and the quiet perseverance of his efforts, he stands as one of the quiet architects of the American Republic, a founder whose legacy invites us to look beneath the surface of events to the structures and convictions that sustain liberty over time. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Ben. You've just heard the story of John Jay, from his Huguenot roots in colonial New York, through revolution and diplomacy, to his work on the bench and in the governor's office, and finally to his quiet years at Bedford. Along the way, we saw how he helped draft constitutions, negotiate peace, shape the federal judiciary, and lay legal groundwork for the gradual abolition of slavery in New York. This narrative is a doorway, not a destination. If Jay's life has sparked questions or challenged assumptions, that's exactly what Unbound American Stories is here to do. Open up our shared past and encourage you to dig deeper with solid historical scholarship. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories of the men and women who built this country, often out of sight of the spotlight.